How's that for a slice of fried gold?
You think this is a fucking costume? This is a way of life.
I'll be back.
There's a flesh wound. I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm just gonna bash your brains.
Take your sticking paws off me, you damn dirty ape!
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare, huh?
I was surprised she was able to get both of her legs behind her head. And, you know, from there, things just opened up for me, literally and metaphorically. And, you know, what can I say? Fourth grade was a weird time.
What the fuck are you talking about?
I don't know. We're supposed to be talking about something, so it just doesn't start awkwardly. And I think I ended up.
It can always just start with Gary saying, "Well, hello," and
I
think talking about kindergarten sex.
Yeah, that's made it more awkward anyway.
Sorry, guys. Happy Halloween.
Well, hello, and welcome to Cinema Shock, citizens, the podcast that explores the stories behind your favorite cult and genre films. I am one of your hosts, Gary Horn.
Hey, I'm not doing a fun voice, but I'm Justin Bishop.
I always have a fun voice, and I'm Todd Davis.
Todd, the horror guy Davis.
Yes. From now on.
That's it. Todd, the horror guy Davis. We just released our Halloween special a few days ago. I hope you enjoyed that, where me and Todd didn't really count down. It wasn't a countdown because Todd spent months putting together a list of horror movies, but did not bother to actually rank them. It was just a random list.
Oh, okay. I haven't heard this yet, so no rankings.
No. I mean, it just came out a few hours ago as of the time we're recording this, but as of the time you're listening to this, it came out several days ago. So hopefully you've had a chance to listen to it. It was fun though. Gary wasn't there, as you could probably guess, since he didn't know that there was no countdown. Gary ghosted us. Not really. Yeah. He told us he wasn't going to be there. So
I was about to say, to be fair, I was told like a day or so before.
I know. Yeah, it was a very last minute thing, but but me and Todd made it happen, didn't we, Todd?
Yeah, we did.
We're committed.
It's a big weekend. It's Halloween weekend as we're recording this.
Halloween.
This is Halloween. Actually, on this day, this is Halloween. This is Halloween. Anyway, so yeah, we're doing it. I just want
to see Billie Eilish do the Sally song.
No,
I saw you post it, but I did not.
Yeah,
did not watch it.
It's good. You should check it out.
I will. That sounds fun.
Yeah, they did. Danny Elfman did this big. He does it. I don't know if he does it every year, but he's done it several times where he does a big concert with the music from Nightmare Before Christmas.
Yeah.
And this time he had the guy who did Oogie Boogie's voice actually reprising his role. And then Lock, Shock, and Barrel, he had Paul Rubens, who is one of the original ones. And he had Weird Al as one of them, which is pretty fun. But then he had Billie Eilish come out and do Sally's song. And then at the end, when she comes back to do that reprise. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't televised or anything, but you can find YouTube videos.
Nice. Yeah, I'll look that up. That sounds dope.
Pretty cool. Anyway, you guys ready to talk about some Wachowski movies?
Yeah, we didn't have a horror movie.
Civil discord.
No spookies.
That's why we did a Halloween special with me and Todd that you were invited to.
Oh, at least I was going to say, at least we have a person in a mask.
Yeah, lots of people in masks.
Yeah, quite a few. Most of the population. Yeah. Aren't we all kind of wearing masks?
Really? Oh, we're getting deep.
Nothing spooky here unless you hate fascism. Ooh.
Unless you hate fascism, it's spooky, or unless maybe you are a fascist, and then
I guess either way. I
guess so. That's true.
Either way, there's something to be scared of here.
So can we just start the show? I guess.
Yeah.
I think
I can't think of a good way to really transition into this, so I'm just gonna get going for episode 4 of our Wachowski series, our series looking at the career of the Wachowskis. So if you've been listening, you know that, of course, The Matrix big success, made a couple of sequels, and the sequels were huge. Enormous productions. And after those massive productions on the two Matrix sequels, which we talked about on our last episode, the Wachowskis, Lana and Lilly Wachowski, they were in no big hurry to return to the directing chair. They needed a break. After doing this back-to-back $300 million production, they needed a break. So, but they didn't want to leave filmmaking completely. They weren't really going on a sabbatical. They just didn't want to be in charge of the production. So for the next project that they had attached their names to, they returned to a script that they had been tinkering with since the mid-1990s, since before the production of the first Matrix. And that was an adaptation of the British graphic novel V for Vendetta.
Truth is, there is something terribly wrong with this country.
Excuse me, miss.
I'm sorry.
Not yet, you're not, but you will be. The only verdict is vengeance. A vendetta. If our own government was responsible for the deaths of 100,000 people, you really want to know?
You're getting back at them for what they did to you.
What was done to me was monstrous.
And they created a monster.
Fear became the ultimate tool of this government.
I want this country to realize that we stand on the edge of oblivion. I want everyone to remember why they need us.
I wish I wasn't afraid all the time.
People should not be afraid of their governments. Government should be afraid of their people. It is you.
Several prominent party members have been murdered, Chief Inspector.
This is exactly what he wants.
What?
Chaos. Beneath this mask, there's more than flesh. There is an idea, Mr. Creepy, and ideas are bulletproof. Remember the 5th of November.
So before we get into the development on the film, I thought it would be a good idea to take a quick look at the history of the original comic book that it's based on. V for Vendetta, the comic, was written by the legendary comic book scribe. I would call him legendary. Alan Moore. Alan Moore, one of the best. Early on in his career, he wrote V for Vendetta. So Alan Moore, we haven't talked about him on this show yet, but he was born on November 18th, 1953 in Northampton, England, where he grew up in a neighborhood known as the Boroughs, which was a poverty-stricken area where illiteracy was widespread. But despite that, Moore was a big reader. He, in his words, read omnivorously as a child from the age of 5, checking out books from the local library. And it was around this time he gets into reading that he also starts reading comic strips. Initially, British strips like Topper and The Breezer, but eventually he started reading American imports like The Flash and Detective Comics and Fantastic Four. He starts getting into the superhero stuff. Then in the late 1960s, Moore began publishing his own poetry and essays in fanzines, eventually establishing his own fanzine called Embryo. And through Embryo, Moore became involved in a group known as the Northampton Arts Lab, which was an alternative arts center that would subsequently make significant contributions to the magazine, to Embryo. So they kind of partnered up. And it wasn't long before Alan Moore began dealing LSD at school, and he eventually got expelled for doing so.
That's less cool.
I mean, you'll do what you want. I guess you shouldn't do it at school, probably.
Yeah, probably.
But,
listen, whatever it takes to get through the day.
Yeah. Hey, the headmaster of the school. So he got expelled, and then the headmaster actually reached out to other schools that Moore had applied to and told them not to accept him because he was, this is a quote from Alan Moore, a danger to the moral well-being of the rest of the students there, which was probably true, end quote. Moore wasn't super hung up about it because he really disliked school. He was a good student, although he did note that, growing up in the boroughs, he was kind of top of the class because there was, like I said, a lot of illiteracy. And he did find that when he went to other areas where there was people were better educated, that he was kind of a middle of the road student, but it wasn't a bad student, but he just didn't like it. He had no interest in academic study. And later he even described it as saying that there was this is another quote, a covert curriculum being taught that was designed to indoctrinate children with punctuality, obedience, and acceptance of monotony, which is a very Alan Moore thing to say.
Very.
But he continued to live with his parents for a few more years, kind of bouncing from one unsatisfying blue collar job to another. Eventually got kind of like an office job, but then he finally decided this was not the life for me, and he wanted to earn a living doing something more artistic. So he abandoned his office job, taking up both writing and illustrating his own comics. And many of these early comics appeared in alternative fanzines and magazines. And then in late 1979, Moore and his longtime friend Stephen Moore, no relation, I don't think, they co-created a violent cyborg character named Axel Pressbutton for some comics in the British magazine. It's a music magazine actually called Dark Star. I looked up Pressbutton because I'd never heard of this character, but it was a pretty popular character. He appeared in that the Dark Star magazine, but he did eventually get his own comic. He was described, this character Pressbutton is described as a violent cyborg with the face of Ernest Borgnine, a button on his chest which delivers orgasmic pleasure when pressed, and a phobia about vegetation.
Interesting. All right.
Don't think the movie would have been made about that one.
No, I would. I mean, I'd watch it. It sounds like something that could be in heavy metal or something. Honestly,
I was just thinking like all of this sounds like something that would appear in heavy metal for sure.
So this character, and it was actually written and drawn under Alan Moore's pseudonym of Kurt Weill, which is not the singer-songwriter that is currently quite popular today. It's actually a play on a name of a German composer, I think. Kurt Weill, and then Steve Moore's pseudonym of Pedro Henry. This is who they published this under. It ended up being a very popular character when further stories appeared in a music newspaper called Sounds and in a comics anthology called Warrior. And by time it really was an ongoing thing, the character was being drawn and written primarily by Pedro Henry, by Steve Moore. And during this,
did any of that stuff make it overseas at all?
Oh yeah, you can find the Pressbutton stuff. I don't know that Warrior ever made it overseas, but there are collections of the Pressbutton stuff.
Yeah,
I don't know if any of it's still in print now. I haven't looked, but yes,
I'll have to deep dive, see what I can find. It sounds fun.
So during this period, Moore would go on to create additional underground comics, often using pseudonyms. But it was when he linked up with 2000 AD, one of Britain's most prominent comic magazines, that his career would move into the mainstream. I think we've talked about 2000 AD here on the show in the past, but
I'm sure it's come up at least once or twice. Probably when we talked about heavy metal, I imagine, because a lot of that stuff kind of came out of that area of the world, and a lot of that stuff. Judge Dredd obviously came from 2000 AD, and a couple other things. But yeah.
Will you stop clapping in front of the microphone?
Yeah, sorry. There's this gnat. I'm sorry.
I just thought he had a weird tick he's developed over the last week.
I'm just super excited to be here, but just in little spurts of just like, yay.
So Moore was interested in writing for 2000 AD, and he submitted a script for their long-running Judge Dredd series. So while they didn't really need any writers for Judge Dredd, they had writers, but fellow writer Alan Grant saw a lot of promise in Moore's work and hired him to write some short stories for the publication's series called Future Shock. So Moore starts writing for 2000 AD. And he did spend a lot of the early 80s as a freelance writer, being offered work by Marvel UK, actually, and the publishers of 2000 AD and Warrior. And it was with Warrior magazine that Moore would, in his words, start to reach his potential. He was initially given 2 ongoing strips in Warrior, a Marvel Man, which later changed to Miracle Man due to obvious copyright issues, and V for Vendetta, the latter of which was co-created with artist David Lloyd.
Part of what Justin's talking about when Alan Moore is reaching his potential here is that Alan Moore slowly morphed into a wizard.
Yes.
And at least in his own mind.
Yeah. So this was around that time, I think.
Yeah.
The hair started growing out. He started looking like Gandalf, and
it's got a little bit more of a Rasputin look. Let's be honest.
Yeah, that's
than Gandalf
for sure. Well, a buddy of mine who lives over in England, Jake Donaldson, he's another comedian. He told me the story of working a gig over there in a pub, and this one dude, this kind of weird looking dude, came backstage and started hanging out with all the comedians, and like bouncer said nothing, bartender said nothing. They just kind of let him wander back there. And it didn't dawn on him until one of the other comedians went up to him and was like, I love Watchmen. And was like, oh, it's Alan Moore just hanging out backstage with all the comedians.
Weird.
Like, yeah, he just does that.
The weird thing about that is that I didn't realize that Alan Moore had a sense of humor.
I was about to say the same thing. He seems like the least funny creative person. So,
well, he just knows where to find damaged people. And with them.
So the first V for Vendetta strips appeared in Warrior magazine in black and white between 1982 and 1985, where, according to Warrior publisher Des Skin, great name, by the way, it was one of the least popular strips in the magazine. He would later say, quote, if I'd have given each character their own title, the failures would have certainly outweighed the successes, with the uncompromising V for Vendetta probably being an early casualty. So he's saying that people didn't particularly like it, or at least his readers didn't particularly like it. And Warrior ended up getting canceled by its publisher in 1985, with 2 completed issues never published. After cancellation, though, several companies, they saw the potential in V for Vendetta, and they tried to convince Moore and Lloyd to let them publish and complete the story for them. And the two eventually paired up with DC Comics. In 1988, DC published a 10-issue series that reprinted the original Warrior stories, but in color. The only reason they weren't printed in color in Warrior wasn't a creative choice. It was because Warrior couldn't afford to print them in color. So DC prints them with color this time, and then continued the series to completion, with the first new material appearing in issue number 7.
Nice.
So I actually reread the comic leading up to this, and I was very curious where it stopped, like where the Warrior publication stopped back in the early 80s. Because you got to think, Warrior was canceled in 1985. It was 1988 before DC picked it up. So 3 years. It ends, the issue in the graphic novel, the chapter that ends where Warrior's publication would have ended, the final frame or the final, whatever you call it, the final page of that is when Evie walks out after being tortured and kidnapped, and she walks out of her cell and into the shadow gallery, realizing that it was V the whole time. And that's where it stopped. Can you imagine being an avid reader at the time? Yeah. And that's when it stops, and then the magazine gets canceled.
My God.
What a cliffhanger.
Yeah. Geez, that actually happened to me. I was reading, there was a book that started up right after high school called Stormwatch Team Achilles. And this was 2002, 2003, like right after 9/11. And it was very like politically driven. And I didn't usually read stuff like this, but it was really good. And like, it had a lot of weight to it. The art was amazing. And then it got to a point where mid storyline, there just wasn't anymore. Apparently, like the writer got fired, and
wow.
Yeah, it's a whole big thing. But like, I can speak to that feeling of just having, you're into this story, you're really into it, and then just crickets, nothing.
Because I mean, once it got canceled, readers didn't know that it was going to get picked back up by DC Comics later on,
right?
So for all they knew, it was done.
Yeah.
Like,
why getting canceled?
Yeah, but I think that's going to come back. Honestly, I think HBO is going to pick it up or something. HBO.
Wait, why got canceled?
Yeah, why got canceled before the final season even ended? FX canceled it. And
I was gonna say it just started, didn't it?
Yeah. But I think HBO is going to pick it up because
it's
HBO's
DC.
own. It's the same company. Yeah, exactly. Anyway, so V for Vendetta. Back to V for Vendetta.
Yeah, sorry.
The comic's plot was drawn upon an idea that Alan Moore has submitted to a script writing competition way back in 1975. It wasn't based on that, but it kind of took ideas from that. And that comic was called The Doll. And it actually involved a transgender or transsexual, as Moore described it, terrorist in whiteface makeup who fought against a totalitarian state in the then futuristic 1980s. So once they began to develop the comic together, it was actually David Lloyd who suggested dressing the character of V up as Guy Fawkes, because previous designs were more traditionally kind of superhero looks. So that was actually a contribution from Lloyd. That was not in Moore's original plan. And then the political climate of the early 80s in Britain also heavily influenced Moore's writing on the comic. In his comic, Margaret Thatcher's conservative government would lose the 1983 elections. This, of course, didn't happen at the time he was writing. Those elections had not happened yet. He was sort of sure that they were going to happen, and that's why he wrote that into his comics. And then when Moore wrote his introduction to the first issue of the DC publication in 1988, 5 years later, Thatcher was entering her third term of office. So he clearly kind of missed the mark on that prediction.
Didn't have your finger on the pulse of the political climate, did you, Allie?
Allie.
I don't know why I said that.
They're tight.
And in the years since its publication, the comic has come to be known as one of Moore's best works, a milestone in comic publishing, an important component, I think, in the shift in comics taking a darker, more adult-oriented approach. I think it's a combination of Moore's work and Frank Miller's work that really moved comics in that direction, for better or worse.
Yeah, most folks always point to Alan Moore's work here and Watchmen, and then
Watchmen and the Dark
Knight Returns.
The 80s got like really grim and gritty. For a long time, they'd not been. Comics weren't really taken seriously for anybody who doesn't know that. I mean, it's all this pow, bang, zip. Like the 60s Batman show, is what people thought of when they thought of comic books.
Right.
And so people started to get a handle on, you could do more stuff with comic books than that. You can start telling more serious stories. And
in the wake of like Vietnam and, starting into the Reagan era, it got very cold and dark and all of that stuff.
Well, with things like this magazine too, and in other places, I mean, with a guy like Alan Moore, I mean, what you start to realize is you can't do as much as you want to with like the big names. The publishers are going to be pretty protective of those, but you could start taking characters that nobody cares about and telling different stories. Like when they kept referencing on one documentary, it was like Swamp Thing and stuff like that. But But anyway, like Justin said, the British writers are all very politicized around this time. And so it all kind of makes a nice, perfect storm for stuff like V. And because I think even, they were going to make it originally like a urban guerrilla. That was like part of the idea. Alan wanted something more theatrical. Which led to David Lloyd thinking of the Guy Fawkes mask.
Which was a thing previous to this. The idea that like the mask, it didn't look like this one, but Guy Fawkes mask did not originate with them.
No, so like in the 20th century, they would like the early 20th century. I mean, it was around. I mean, since like the late 1800s, I think they had like the celebration and like they even had like issues with it and stuff. Like it was a pretty well-known thing through like the 50s, and then sort of in the 80s, it had kind of fallen out of favor. They said like Halloween had become like hugely popular, so like the idea of wearing the Guy Fawkes mask. And during this time when they had this idea, David Lloyd wrote a note, like basically when they were working on developing the story. And the note said, why don't we portray him as a resurrected Guy Fawkes, complete with one of those papier-mâché masks and a cape and conical hat? He'd look really bizarre. It would give Guy Fawkes the image he's deserved after all these years. We shouldn't burn the chap every November 5th, but celebrate his attempt to blow up Parliament. And Alan Moore said, quote after that, how interesting it was that we should have taken up the image right at that point where it was apparently being purged from the annals of English iconography. He said, all of the various fragments in my head suddenly fell into place, united behind that single image.
Yeah.
Oh, also very Alan Moore talking. But,
I like that. Like the idea like one thing sparks like an avalanche of ideas, which kind of honestly works into the themes of the film itself.
Very much.
So,
yeah. And so like you mentioned, the Guy Fawkes mask, it wasn't original to this, but David Lloyd, the season that it all took place in, he couldn't find one, so he had to make up his own. So the image of the Guy Fawkes mask that you see is created by David Lloyd with like the rosy cheeks and the weird grin on it. And and another thing about this comic too that I found interesting is like, and I bought the graphic novel for this just to read it. their idea was to make it more filmic in the first place. Like David Lloyd wanted it to be taken more seriously.
Well, Alan Moore's original, according to David Lloyd, at least in interviews around the time that the movie came out, he said that Alan Moore originally conceived the story as a script, as a film script.
Oh, maybe that's true. Yeah. And I know David Lloyd said he always hated like thought bubbles and stuff like that in the comics. So they wanted to write it like more narrative.
Yeah.
And, they even tried like,
there are no thought bubbles in this. That's I've never considered that, but you're right. There are no thought bubbles in the comic.
Yeah. They were trying to, he was like, you wouldn't have access to that part of the character. So we didn't want to display that. They like color wise, you know, you mentioned it being in black and white, and that would just be because they couldn't afford color at the time. But they also were like typically trying to avoid like super splashy, colorful scenes even later, just because they didn't want to like push away people that would be thrown off by what they expect from a comic book or something like that. So when DC started like trying to pull in the British folk, you know, and they brought it back, that was all stuff they were thinking about. And it was just kind of interesting hearing that story. And, you know, this is all right at the time. I think when they were picking it back up, Alan was already writing The Watchmen and writing new issues of V. Which is interesting. And
they were being published simultaneously for a brief period.
I guess it's worth mentioning too, just for the hell of it, that Guy Fawkes, for those who don't know on that too, I mean, it kind of gives you that story, but he's, you know, he was under Parliament and going to blow it up with gunpowder, basically. But he wasn't like, everybody makes it out to be like a freedom thing, but his was religion. Like he was a stark Catholic, and the Catholics felt like they were not being recognized at the time. Because like Elizabeth I had come in. Sorry, I read a bunch about Guy Fawkes, so I just wanted to.
It's okay,
to throw that up here on the podcast.
Yeah,
but you know, when Elizabeth I came in, she starts recognizing all of the religions mostly, and she was Protestant, I think, and like Catholics had typically been like the main religion in England, and so they felt like they were kind of being shit on by Elizabeth, and then in 1570, the Pope basically just excommunicated Elizabeth I and told the Catholics they don't have to listen to her anymore. You know, that caused the whole thing. And so they were waiting for, like, on her deathbed, she named us. They had a lot of issues with her. Like, she wasn't getting married. She wasn't having like a direct descendant. She like didn't hand over the reign, like the throne, until her deathbed. She gave it to James I. And then they were waiting to see, because he came from like Mary, Queen of Scots, and he had been from a Catholic family, but he recognized as Protestant. And so then they felt like they still weren't getting any love. And so this is when everybody started getting a little rebellious. And so like the actual plot was from like a guy named Robert Catesby. I think he's mentioned in the thing, like it's one of those names they look up on the computer. Yeah, so they're going to the House of Lords, and it's like a time when they're setting up. It's on November 5th, and so they start storing gunpowder underneath Parliament in that exact place. It's a little different than the movie, like where it was going to be set up. Guy Fawkes gets brought in. He had been like living in Spain or something, and somebody sent an anonymous letter to this Catholic lord named Monteagle, and on the 4th of November, Guy Fawkes, he was hanging out waiting for Parliament to sit on the 5th, and he was discovered under the building. And
got fucking narked on.
Yeah, he got narked on. But some of the guys, like when they were saying this, I think it might have been Lloyd or something, said he was like sitting in a pub one day and saw a sign hanging up that says Guy Fawkes, the only man to ever step foot in Parliament with honest intentions.
Yeah. That's good.
Nice. But it wasn't so much freedom with that. I just thought, you know, just for historically, it was to create like chaos. They were just gonna like
anarchy.
Yeah,
which is a major
anarchy.
Plot of
the graphic novel.
The comic. Yeah, more so than the movie. So the graphic novel comes out, or the comics come out. Of course, it's collected into full graphic novels later on, but it was pretty popular when it came out, which of course means that it's inevitable that Hollywood would come calling, and it did not take long at all for Hollywood to come calling on this. In 1988, the year that it was published, producer Joel Silver acquired the rights to two of Moore's works, V for Vendetta and The Watchmen.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which had just come out as well. So the initial screenwriter that Silver had hired to make the adaptation was a writer named Hilary Hinken. She's now an Oscar winner. She wrote the the screenplay for Wag the Dog and won an Oscar for that. But at the time, she was best known for penning the screenplay for the modern masterpiece, also produced by Joel Silver, called Roadhouse.
Oh, cool.
Y'all didn't know we had a Roadhouse connection on this.
Nice.
Was Patrick Swayze going to play V? Because sold.
Yeah, I would be the
Exactly.
Honestly, yes. And Hincken's screenplay was not particularly well received, and seems to have a hard time knowing. I couldn't. I'll preface this by saying I could not find the full screenplay, but I did find some summaries of her screenplay, and it seems that her screenplay has a hard time knowing if it's a straight drama or a satire. So, case in point, in her version of V for Vendetta, the government headquarters are in the shape of their namesake. So like the noses building looks like a giant nose, the ears building looks like a giant ear, etc. And Bishop Lilliman is part of a religion in the movie and in the comic. I'd say he's pretty strictly a regular bishop or priest or whatever. But in her version, he was part of a religion that's part Catholicism and part airplane safety demonstration. And the fingermen, who are, the like police kind of this world.
Yes, I'm somewhat
in her
of a
version
fingerman
of
myself.
In her version, they are genetically engineered half man, half goat creatures.
I mean,
okay.
It's a choice. But the thing is, a lot of the rest of her script is played pretty straight, with a lot of the plot points playing out exactly as they do in the comic. Which makes all the weird, goofy, like satirical elements or the silly stuff like a giant nose building or a half man, half goat creature seem a little like weird. Like they don't fit together, It
feels like this whole script was repurposed as like Tank Girl or something.
Yeah. And there's also a very big divergence with V's character, who in her version, it is revealed to actually be Evie's father. Now, that's something that is played with in the comic book, because he kind of like toys with her emotions a little bit in the comic, that he might be her long lost father, before eventually saying, "No, I'm not your father." It's very clear. But in her version of the script, in Hinkman's version, it's definitive. He is Evie's father.
Oh, wow.
So this script, for reasons that I think are pretty obvious, was thrown out. It was never used.
Yeah.
But by the mid-1990s, a couple of up-and-coming filmmakers took a stab at the story themselves. And they were, of course, Lana and Lilly Wachowski, who were longtime fans of the comic book. And they had begun developing their version of the script back before The Matrix even began. This was something they'd been working on for years. And their original script, their original draft, followed the graphic novel pretty closely. But the adaptation never really got off the ground, maybe because they were, at the time, still inexperienced filmmakers. And of course, then they did Bound, and then their attention shifted to The Matrix.
Joel Silver, who just sounds like a bro, always. My favorite part of anything was seeing an interview with him where he was like, I hadn't even heard of a graphic novel before this. And I don't know if that's normal or not, but that just caught me off guard. But he described the original script, like he said he saw it, and it was just very, very dense, which doesn't surprise me with what we know about them so far.
Right.
He said it just didn't have the punchiness that this movie has.
So during post-production on the second and third Matrix films, they revised the screenplay a little bit. They moved the time period forward, because the original graphic novel set in like the 90s, 1997, 1998. So they moved the time period forward. They never really say when this movie takes place, but what I've seen, it seems to be right around 2028. And they also made Evie older. Evie in the comic is 16 years old, and she's a sex worker. So they changed a lot of stuff, but that's one of the main things that they changed. And they offered the script to James McTeigue. They actually took him out, like, I think for his birthday one year, and they asked him about the graphic novel, like if he'd ever read it. They gave him they gave a copy of it to him, I think, for his birthday. And then basically, as sort of a birthday gift, hey, you want to direct this movie?
Nice.
Yeah. So while V for Vendetta would mark his directorial debut, McTeague's career in the film industry began in the late 1980s, where he worked as a production runner or production assistant on a number of small movies filmed in his native Australia. But over the years, he worked his way up to third and then second assistant director, and he broke into mainstream Hollywood in 1994 as the second AD for the Ray Liotta film No Escape, which I remember liking a lot when I was a kid. I have not seen it since, so who knows? And also the big budget video game adaptation of Street Fighter, the comic book. You know, the Jean-Claude Van Damme. He was the second AD on that. So those are his first like Hollywood movies that he worked. He would later be the second AD on Dark City, a film with connections to the Matrix that we discussed back on that episode. And he was actually supposed to be the second AD on the Matrix as well. But when the first AD, the assistant director, who was a friend of McTeague's, had to drop out, the Wachowskis made McTeigue their first assistant director. And then the following year, after the first Matrix, so the Matrix is his first gig as like a first AD. Then the following year, he worked as the first AD under a guy named George Lucas on a little film called Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones.
Oh, one of the Star Wars. That George Lucas. Okay.
George Lucas. So that was released in 2002. He followed that up as the first AD on The Matrix Reloaded and The Matrix Revolutions, which, as we know, were filmed as a single large production. And it was during post-production on Revolutions that the Wachowskis introduced McTeigue to V for Vendetta. So he gets the job. I mean, that's a pretty
good gig.
It's a good gig, and it shows that the Wachowskis really had faith in his abilities, like to be able to give him something that they'd been working on at this point for over a decade.
Well, knowing how well they pitch things, for him to be able to interpret and follow along as an AD shows that he's on the same page with them, whatever they're doing.
Yeah, they seem to. I don't know if it was more him or the Wachowskis. I guess had a big part of it, but just they said they tried to work on knocking down the novel to make it more filmic, but it was already drawn that way. So I guess they're just like picking and choosing what to do. And
you still can't adapt every little thing because it would have been a 4-hour movie, 5-hour movie, right? So that they had to. I think one thing that they really changed a lot from the original graphic novel. I mean, there's a lot of plot points that are changed pretty significantly, but the graphic novel focuses a lot on the personal lives of members of the Norse Fire Party. Like you see their home lives, and they're not exactly painted as like good people or sympathetic, but they are painted as like actual human beings, whereas in the movie, they're definitely a little bit more black and white, like these are the villains kind of thing. Especially Sutler, who in the graphic novel is named Susan. His last name is Susan, not Sutler, but it seems like they crossed Susan with Hitler and created the name Sutler.
They were definitely going for the Hitler vibes.
So.
Oh yeah.
But in the comic, he like falls in love with the computer that's known as Fate. Because you in the movie, you've got the voice of Fate, which is essentially like a Fox News kind of news channel broadcast. But in the comic, it's like the voice of Fate is like giving announcements to the people, and Fate is a supercomputer. And in the comic, the Sutler character, Susan, literally like falls in love with a computer. It's very bizarre and very weird, and he's a much more complicated character.
And that's going to be the big thing as we're talking about this, is you're going to hear like most people have an issue with, including Alan Moore himself. I mean, there's a lot of like intricacies that are left on the table here with these people. They also tried to focus more on the relationship with V and Evie.
For sure.
And like Evie's a smarter character in the movie, I think, than she is really in the graphic novel.
She's very naive in the graphic novel, at least at the beginning.
And like you said, they give, another difference is, they make it pretty black and white on who the bad guys are. There's never even any, like, I don't know, barely any discussion on that at all. Like, they straight up go into, ethnic minorities are used for experiments, and homosexuality is illegal and all of that stuff.
Which, in the graphic novel, these people are still very much painted as the villains. You know a little bit more about their motivation. Like some of them are true believers in this, and even though their beliefs are shitty, they're still true believers. And some of them are just trying to make it up the corporate ladder kind of thing,
Yeah.
but they all have their motivations, and you do get to see that, which I understand why you wouldn't necessarily.
It's a lot to try to tackle in a movie.
Yeah,
so I don't blame them for like, you can't, there's lots of sides to all these stories, and you just can't do it.
Right.
This is all at the end of the day. I mean, I think McTeigue even says, like, at the end of the day, this is still a action movie and a superhero movie. And
right.
Well, actually, his exact quote is, there's a lot of discussion about this political idea. It's very good, but at the end of the day, this is a fictional story based on a comic book, and I didn't want that to get lost. If you get that stuff on the other side, that's fine. I'm making a piece of entertainment, and I want to have fun and use little movie devices to get the story across. I think that actually came up during a section about like the dominoes. When like that little section there, I think that's what he was kind of referring to when he was getting in there, like how hard they worked on the dominoes thing. We'll talk about Owen Patterson in a minute, but they had been working on that. The only reason I'm bringing this up right now is because they had tried it, and it went off and did pretty well, but it happened so fast. Like if you ever hit down dominoes, it's never like the nice, like slow rolling thing. And so it went too fast and it missed like one or two. So they had to call a guy named Robin Wires, who is known in Hollywood as as Mr. Domino. And like, apparently this is what he does. He works with domino and domino art, and is very good at helping movies when they need to use dominoes. I have no fucking clue.
There is a job in Hollywood for everyone.
Anyway, Mr. Domino, thank you for.
Well, we're not that far into production yet. We're still. James McTeigue just got hired.
Well, I know I jumped ahead, but I just I thought it just flowed naturally.
Did it? Okay.
Well, because I talked about the little movie devices, McTeigue said.
That's true.
Well, the dominoes are in the comic book.
Oh yeah, that's right.
The dominoes are in the comic book. Yeah, he does that in the comic. It's a big part of one of the issues where it keeps cutting to him.
Oh yeah, push that push.
Yeah.
Well, you slippery bastard, McTeigue.
So anyway, McTeigue met. We mentioned that he had worked on Attack of the Clones, and it was on the set of Attack of the Clones where he first met Natalie Portman, who he would eventually cast as Evie Hammond, though she was not the first and only choice for the role. He had her in mind for it, and he had faith that she would be great, but they did test some other actors such as Scarlett Johansson and Bryce Dallas Howard, but he says that Natalie Portman just came in and owned it. Like, she totally understood the character of Evie.
I saw Keira Knightley was also on that list.
All good choices, but yeah.
I mean, also from, well, she wasn't in Attack of the Clones, I guess. She was just in Phantom Menace.
They were just looking for a Natalie Portman lookalike. That's what it was.
So Portman ended up working with dialect coach Barbara Berkery to speak in that British accent, which I think is a fine British accent. I don't know.
I was going to say, how do we feel about Natalie Portman?
I mean, I think it's fine. I don't know. I'm not British, so I'm probably not the best person to comment on it. I know that I can tell a bad American accent when somebody who's not American is doing one.
There you go.
But I don't know. I mean, it's fine to me, but I know I've heard people talk shit about it, but I think she does fine. Portman, she really, like, she's an incredibly intelligent person. Like, Natalie Portman's sort of a genius. Yeah. I think she went to Harvard. Like, she's incredibly intelligent. And so when she was preparing for this role, she watched films such as The Weather Underground, which is a 2002 documentary about the radical left-wing revolutionaries in the late 60s and early 70s who bombed the Capitol building and broke Timothy Leary out of prison. They are called The Weather Underground. And then she also read the autobiography of famed Israeli Prime Minister I'm going to say this wrong. Menachem Begin. Is that right, Gary? Am I saying that right?
I don't know why you think I'm Israeli. Like, I would know that. I was looking at the name and thinking it's probably, and I mean this with all due respect, knowing Israel like I do, it's probably something like Menachem. It's got that sound.
Like the guys from Canon Films.
Right.
What's his name? It's something similar to that. Anyway, he was an Israeli prime minister. And in this autobiography, he describes early Soviet imprisonment and subsequent leadership of Irgun, which is this militant Zionist group in Palestine responsible for terrorist activities intent on expelling the British from Palestine. So she's researching this kind of some stuff that's sort of from V's point, what have similar ideologies, I guess, as V might have.
Yeah, Stephen Fry, in one of the things I was watching, mentioned, one of the cool parts to try to think about with this is like one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter.
Yeah,
and,
right.
Exactly.
That's
a cool quote.
That's a very cool quote. I love Stephen Fry. He's wonderful.
He's fantastic.
He's really great in this and in everything. I just love that guy. So for his part, director McTeigue has said that he was influenced by a host of films, most notable among them Guillermo Pontecorvo's 1965 film, The Battle of Algiers, which is a highly realistic account of the Algerian Revolution against the French, fought from 1954 to 1962. Really good movie. If you haven't seen it, I would recommend checking it out. It's streaming on it's a long time member of the Criterion collection, so you can find it on the Criterion channel and on DVD and Blu-ray. But you should check that out. It's a really great war film. So in the title role of V, an actor named James Purfoy was cast initially. Purfoy, he's not a huge name actor in the realm of movies, but he does remain one of those character actors who often appears in prominent supporting roles, especially on television, where he's mostly worked since really before 2005, although he had, prior to V, had some significant supporting roles in A Knight's Tale and in the first Resident Evil movie.
I'm not sure like how huge it was for everyone, but I watched that show The Following with Kevin Bacon, which is based off that like old Scream script or whatever, that with the cult leader. He played the cult leader, Joe Carroll.
Right. Well, yeah. And he played, I think, Marcus Aurelius in Rome on HBO after this as well. Yeah. So he played big roles, but those two roles come after the V for Vendetta debacle, because I'm sure our listeners are thinking, wait a second, this guy's not fucking V. I thought that was Hugo Weaving. And you would be right. Purfoy ended up dropping out of the production a few weeks into filming. And at the time when it happened, it was reported that he had issues wearing the mask for the entire film. But in later interviews, he would say, and this is a quote, "The only rumor I can scotch is that if anyone thinks I was too pussy to wear the mask, they're completely wrong. It has nothing to do with wearing the mask." McTeigue, McTeigue kind of refutes this. He has said in several interviews that it wasn't necessarily because Purfoy just didn't want to wear a mask. He wasn't like being vain or anything. It was because he realized that his main tool as an actor, which is his face, was being taken away, and that it was sort of a mutual understanding that this just wasn't working. And then Joel Silver would later say that it was a voice thing. He called it a voice thing, that Purfoy didn't sound menacing enough. Purfoy himself, he says that he left due to genuine creative differences about the way to approach the character of V. So who knows? It's a he said.
They wanted me to sound like Hugo Weaving, and I couldn't. And so they hired Hugo Weaving.
Yeah, so he was replaced by Hugo Weaving, who, of course, we know worked with Silver and the Wachowskis and McTeigue on the Matrix series. And Weaving was actually excited about the mask because he came from a traditional school of acting where mask work was actually a big part of his training. So he was actually very much looking forward to being able to do this.
He talks about, the mask is, it's hard for some people. It's like, it's just very claustrophobic. You've got limited vision up and down and to the sides and all of that.
Well, you also show all of your emotion on your face, and you're not able to do that. So you're having to do everything with body language.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Like all of V's dialogue is completely dubbed. Initially,
he said the dialogue on set, but obviously they couldn't properly mic that. So he had to perform the whole role twice.
Yeah, they had tried to, they had put a small microphone inside. Another one was designed that lit along his hairline at one point, but neither would work well enough that they could do it. Certain scenes of the movie still feature James Purfoy as V. There's a very small number of scenes where he's in the suit, but then they just dubbed Hugo's. Yeah, McTeigue says, can I tell the difference? Yes. Can the audience tell? I doubt it. Hugo also said he based his accent on Harold Wilson, the British Prime Minister from 1964 to 1970 and 1974 to 1976. That's a fun fact for you. If you're wondering what Harold Wilson sounds like, he sounds like Hugo Weaving, apparently. So it's
he's not talking in an Australian accent, at least. So
yeah, that's true.
Which is his native accent.
He just really, Hugo Weaving has such a distinct, like, there's something about his tone that you just can't.
Well, you also, like, most of his major roles that you've seen Hugo Weaving in, The Matrix, Lord of the Rings, he's not speaking in his native accent.
That's true.
Because
even as Red Skull or something, he's
he's not in Red Skull. He's doing the German thing, in Lord of the Rings, and in this, he's doing the British thing. And then, of course, he does the Walter Cronkite thing in the Matrix movies.
Oh, yeah. I forgot he used Walter Cronkite.
What really throws people off is that at one point, though, he definitely refers to Evie as Mr. Anderson. So it gets awkward then.
Other roles in the film were filled out by esteemed European actors, mostly from the UK, such as Stephen Rea, who is mostly known, or most well known, I should say, for his breakout role in The Crying Game, for which he received an Academy Award. Stephen Fry, who we already mentioned. Stephen Fry is a legendary director, producer, comedian, actor. Like, he's done it all. I mean, I guess it kind of made his name with a little bit of Fry and Laurie, the comic duo with him and Hugh Laurie from, now we know from House, but that's kind of where he made his name.
Super intelligent guy, and
he's a cool dude. I really like him.
They asked the question in one interview, how did you get this role? And he's just got I'd love to tell you that I was frolicking in the forest one day and I kicked over a rock, and out from under the rock an elf came out, and the elf told me, I have a role for you. You'd be perfect for it. But no, none of that happened. My agent called and said, hey, you should go read for this movie. But when they asked what he liked about the role, he said, being beaten up. I hadn't been beaten up in a movie before, and I was very excited about being clubbed to death.
I love that. And of course, playing Sutler, who we mentioned before, is the legendary John Hurt. And this is sort of a reversal of his role from the big screen adaptation of 1984, which I think I don't know if that was intentional on like McTeigue and the Wachowskis' part, but John Hurt saw the connection, certainly, when he started playing the role.
Well, John Hurt, he's wild. They asked him, he was like, I was snorting crack cocaine, which is not typically how you do it, but it was on a hooker's asshole, and I don't know what else I'm supposed to do. And anyway, and then they said, friend, you've done 1984. And I said, well, is it still 1984? Then yes, of course. I thought we were much later in time. And anyway, finished smoking the crack in the hooker ass, and off I went. I don't know. I have no idea what I'm doing with that.
Is that a direct
quote?
That's a direct quote from John Hurt.
That's a good story.
That's what John Hurt be doing, y'all.
Well, he's dead, so he's not doing anything now. He's passed on.
He was buried with his crack. Crack and crack. That's the real important. That's the poetic part of this story that you don't know. See, he's still classy.
Oh, I get it. Wow.
I should say Stephen Fry's character. I mean, I guess maybe we'll talk more about more of these, but his character, Gordon Dietrich, is one of the ones that also is like very different in this movie. Like Stephen Fry
barely plays talking about versus the graphic novel.
Yeah.
He barely plays a role in the graphic novel. Like, it's a very small character and obviously a very important character here.
Yeah. I mean, and this guy is like more like V and is a gay man. And like in the graphic novel, he's actually in a relationship, I guess, with Evie and stuff like that. So he's more slimy in the graphic novel. And in this one, Fry was like pushing for as a gay man, I guess, just that.
Stephen Fry saw it like he really liked this role because, it's something that he could relate to because Stephen Fry is a gay man, but he has not always been like out of the closet during his professional career. I mean, he has been for quite a few years now. And I think even quite a few years at the time of filming this, but he's been, he lived through Margaret Thatcher's England, like the England that inspired Alan Moore to write this, and he wasn't as able to be as open with who he was during that time period.
Todd mentioned this before we started recording, but it's also worth mentioning. This is Imogen Poots' first film. So I think she'd done like a TV thing before this, like a small thing, but this is her first actual film role.
Yeah, she plays the young version of Valerie in this. All right, so while we're on the subject of cast, Todd, did we find any Star Trekkers in this one?
Zero.
None?
Zero Star Trekkers.
Really?
Yep. I was very surprised.
All right. Well,
I was like, okay, I mean, they shot some stuff in England for sure. I mean, most of the stuff was shot in, on the Paramount lots and all that stuff, but like maybe some of the movies. Nope. Nothing.
Well,
Zero.
All right, well, zero, just like the Matrix.
Yep. Not trekking with anybody this week.
Fuck man, you're gonna have to start digging deeper in that crew or something. I don't know.
Yeah. Oh man. I'm gonna have to start, really deep diving, going through the entire list.
So I can say, if I may, Chad Stahelski back for this stunt coordinator. Yep. I don't remember how much detail we've gone into with him, but he's that guy that worked on the Matrix movies.
We went into a lot of detail on the Matrix.
Well, I was going to say we talked about him getting fucked up in the Matrix, and as Neo's double, and he's also like Brandon Lee's double in The Crow, I think.
Yep, we talked about all of that. In our
okay, I couldn't remember. I'd be drinking sometimes during these. Anyway, obviously goes on to direct John Wick. He's back. He's the stunt coordinator. They love him. And he's the one, if you want to see his cameo, he is the guy who literally walks through fire. He wore like a special fire resistant gel and the G-string. That's all he has on in that shot. They had to lower his whole body temperature, and it was like, I think it was like 3 degrees below zero that night.
Whoa.
Wow. On the shoot. 15
so
minutes
when you
before.
see the silhouette of V walking out, that's him? Is that what
that's him. That's Chad Stahelski.
Okay. Well, he also played Storm Saxon in this, which is this like,
I didn't even notice that.
Yeah, he plays Storm Saxon, who's like the TV character, that's him as well.
Okay. But yeah, they had to like put on this like ice cold clothing, like it had been iced down, and then like had to wear that. That's how they lowered his temperature down. It's 3 degrees below zero already. And then they had to cover with fire resistant gel that had also been on ice all day. And then he goes up. So I imagine that scream is real.
Yeah.
Like screaming out.
That sounds awful.
He also helped out in the fight scenes and stuff in this. He describes them as, I wouldn't call them martial arts, more violent theatrics.
Yeah. Yeah.
His quote. And actually, the guy brought in as the fight coordinator here is a guy worth mentioning. His name is Ryan Watson. He had done a lot of stuff before this, but mostly like video game and small bits here and there on TV shows like Buffy and Alias and that sort of thing. But this same year, he had done Serenity and V for Vendetta, which kicked him off like hardcore in the movie.
Oh yeah.
Never not had a role since.
Doesn't he work on The Mandalorian now?
I was gonna say he went from he first ended up being like Zack Snyder's go-to guy.
Okay.
So he started working on 300, and then he went on to like Sucker Punch, Man of Steel, Batman versus Superman.
Wow.
He even did Wonder Woman. But yeah, most recently he's been the fight choreographer for all of The Mandalorian, and also Jungle Cruise with The Rock, if that matters.
I haven't seen that yet.
It's fun.
Yeah, I mean, I want to watch
It's what you'd expect it to be.
Yeah. So some scenes for V for Vendetta were filmed in London proper, but for budgetary purposes, a lot of the production was moved to Potsdam, Germany. I'm assuming I'm saying that right. Potsdam, Germany. It's a suburb of Berlin, and the home of Babelsberg Studio, which is a location where films like, it's this like legendary studio in Germany. Films like Nosferatu and Metropolis were created there. So this place has been around like since the beginning of film as an art form, essentially. Wow. So it's kind of a big deal to the Wachowskis to be able to shoot here because, they're big fans of those old movies. And it was also a place where a lot of Nazi propaganda films were made during a certain time period. So I remember John Hurt saying that felt a little bit weird playing a sort of Nazi-esque, Hitler-esque character giving these big passionate speeches on the same place where like where like Goebbels was having his filmmakers make Nazi propaganda films. But most of the scenes in the film were shot on the sound stages there at Babelsberg, but there was some location work done in Berlin as well, specifically in 3 different locations. There was the Norse Fire rally, that flashback that you get, that's shot on location. All of the scenes in Larkhill are shot on location, and Bishop Lillemann's bedroom. The filming lasted from early March to early June of 2005, and it marked the final film shot by cinematographer Adrian Biddle, who died of a heart attack 4 days before the film made its world debut.
Oh.
So based on his extensive resume, I do imagine that we'll come across Biddle again at some point on this podcast. But this, I believe, is the first mention we've had of him so far on the show. This is a guy, he got to start working for Ridley Scott's advertising company. And then when Ridley Scott moved into films, he kind of followed him, working as a clapper loader on The Duelist, which was Ridley Scott's first movie, and as a focus puller in the camera crew on Alien. And he would later go on to work as a cinematographer on commercials, his most famous of which was an Apple commercial directed by Ridley Scott in 1984, which is a very famous commercial at the time. And his work on that commercial, combined with a personal recommendation by Ridley Scott, got him his first feature film credit as a cinematographer. And that film was James Cameron's Aliens, which is a beautiful film. So the guy's clearly got chops, you know.
Yeah.
He would go on to be the director of photography on 25 films over his career, including The Princess Bride, Willow, Event Horizon, and also on a couple of other Ridley Scott movies. Like he did Thelma and Louise, and he did 1492 Conquest of Paradise, which was I don't know if you guys remember that one. It was a dramatization of Christopher Columbus's voyage to America that I am sure has aged very, very well.
Yeah, I'm sure. I will say this: I watched Event Horizon not too long ago, and it still aged well. And
it's the only good movie that Paul W.S. Anderson ever made.
Yeah, and it looks fantastic.
It does. It's a great film. So to film the final scene at Westminster, which the area from let me say, make sure I'm saying this right in case any of our British fans, because I know we've got some are listening. Trafalgar Square. The area from Trafalgar Square and Whitehall up to Parliament and Big Ben had to be closed for 3 nights from midnight until 5 a.m.
That's the worst English accent I've ever heard, Justin.
I wasn't trying to say it in an English accent. I was just trying to say
you issued an apology beforehand and didn't even try.
But it was a big deal to shut off this area, because this is actually the first time that this area had ever been used in a film production, or had ever been closed down for a film production, because this is a super high security area. This little area that they're closing was home to 10 Downing Street, which is where the PM lives, and the Ministry of Defense. So to close this down is a major security issue. So the fact that they were able to do this at all is pretty impressive.
They were only allowed to, I think background checks had to be conducted on every single actor, actress, technician, anybody, especially if you had a weapon at any point. I mean, there had to be barcodes on every single piece of weaponry that got scanned and tracked for like who is holding this when, and like all of this shit. And yeah, they had to shut down traffic, but they could only do it like 4 minutes at a time. So they had to like shoot stuff in between that.
I remember Stephen Fry in some interviews afterwards said that the way that they were able to get this approved is because this guy, Ewan Blair is his name. He was Tony Blair's son. Tony Blair, British Prime Minister at the time.
Yeah.
He was working on V for Vendetta as like a production assistant or something, he was a set runner, something kind of low on the movie set totem pole, but he was working on the set. And Stephen Fry said the way that they got this done was because he called in some favors because his dad's the prime minister. Tony Blair and his government, of course, probably due to the content of the film, denied that and said that that wasn't the case. That
I was about to say it's pretty crazy. Yeah, like let's use political favors to get a revolutionary film done.
Right.
Man rebelling against the government.
Yeah. Yeah. So who knows? Who knows what side of the story is true? But it's a pretty fun idea.
Well, that's the crazy part with even with the Guy Fawkes thing, throwing back to that for just a brief second, is that, the burning of the effigy of Guy Fawkes was more like a celebration that the Queen lived, instead of, or the King lived, or whatever, that the Empire stayed intact, even though he tried to do it. It's
the opposite of what it's kind of turned into, I guess, with this film.
Right. I mean, maybe it did that in England. I really don't know. Like maybe it became more of a thing later. It just switched on its own. But
so as we discussed previous movies in this series, this Wachowski series, Bound, and especially the Matrix films, the Matrix trilogy, as we were discussing those films, you started to hear a lot of the same names pop up over and over. The Wachowskis kept most of the creative team behind those films together for the entire series. So you would kind of think that V for Vendetta, because they're the producers, that would also be the case. But we already mentioned the cinematographer on this, which is not Bill Pope. It's, Biddle, but that could also, I was thinking about this, could also be due to Bill Pope's experiences on the sequels that Gary discussed in that last episode. He didn't seem to have a great time with it. But aside from the Wachowskis,
I'll have you know, by the way, I got a nice message from one of our listeners saying that they were very proud of me for standing up about the sequels to The Matrix.
Hey, we're all allowed to have opinions here.
And then they were like, I felt the same way, and I didn't even want to rewatch them for this show. And they're like, and I'm just happy to know that I don't have to feel like an idiot completely because I didn't like them.
No, you don't have to like anything that we talk about. Hopefully you do, but hopefully we're not just having you watch a bunch of films that you hate. So
yeah,
well, no, so it's worth it was worth revisiting. I even said that. I was like, I'm glad I rewatched them. Just you have
to remind yourself.
Trying to be honest with myself here.
But aside from the Wachowskis, Joel Silver and McTeigue, the only returning crew member in a significant role, and Gary mentions Chad Stahelski, but the only other returning crew member in a significant role here was production designer Owen Patterson. Patterson, as we know, had been instrumental in bringing the unique look of the Matrix films to life. And I think his work here is just as incredible. Like he's doing this really great. Obviously, clearly motivated by Nazi imagery. I mean, this film is not subtle when it comes to that or most things. But it looks great, I think. And I think the Shadow Gallery in particular is a great piece of production design.
Yeah. I was talking with Justin, yesterday or day before when we did the Halloween recording that it reminded me of Hellboy. Like I was getting a lot of Hellboy vibes with some of that, with the Shadow Gallery specifically. But yeah, it doesn't really look like the Wachowskis movie, but that makes sense because they didn't shoot this. Someone else did.
Right.
But yeah, it's got that really unique look, but it definitely draws you in.
They were pulling from stuff. Obviously, realistic. It was very important to them to film where they filmed and that sort of thing because of these reasons. But even like V's lair I was reading was pretty much a replica of a place in Iraq that had been found where someone had underground, a store, they had just recently dug it up or something that somebody had stored art and stuff in Iraq. It was the exact view of that.
Wow.
So Todd, you mentioned, that the Wachowskis didn't shoot this. And as far as their involvement in the process, McTeigue says that they let him have a lot of freedom on it. And over the years, a lot of people, including myself, I've actually said this before, have theorized that large chunks of the film were possibly ghost directed by the Wachowskis. But according to McTeigue, that was not the case. I've got a lengthy quote from him here, but he says, they were about trusting me to go off and give it the vision it needed to be directed with. So they kind of left me alone. They were there if I needed them. And sometimes I'd go, hey, what do you think about this? And they'd put their 2 cents worth in, and I could either take it on board or leave it at the door. Joel too. They were just about me making the film, which I thought was really respectful. Given their track record, they could insert a lot of influence, but I think I think that thing that they did speaks about them as human beings and how generous they are. So a lot of people, like I said, a lot of people
That's
think
cool.
that this is essentially a Wachowski film, like almost like the Tobe Hooper, Steven Spielberg situation with Poltergeist. A lot of people think the Wachowskis directed a lot of this, but I used to think that, but watching it this time, especially back to back with the Matrix movies and stuff, it does not. It's got some of their fingerprints in the writing, but visually, I don't think it looks like a Wachowski movie at all, with the exception of that final fight with V. I don't think this looks much like a Wachowski movie at all. And part of that theory is that McTeague's subsequent work has not been very good. So a lot of people are like, well, he couldn't have directed this one on his own, but he was working from a better script. That's the thing.
Yeah. But also, Natalie Portman does discover herself in some very Matrix-like raid with her shaved ass head, like coming out almost.
But that's directly out of the graphic novel.
I know. I'm just saying, I could see like the comparisons there already.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, she's an EO.
Yeah, that's one of those scenes that is like shot for shot out of the graphic novel, except in the graphic novel, she is butt ass naked, which I would not have complained about if that they had
Justin. Oh, naughty boy.
Oh. So when the film was released in March of 2006, it was a box office success, not like a major success, but a moderate success, going on to gross $132 million worldwide on a budget of about $54 million, so close to the budget of the first Matrix film. And while it didn't receive widespread acclaim like the first Matrix movie, the film was generally met with positive reviews from critics. But I'm curious how it's aged for some people, Gary, on the internet. I wonder how some of our armchair reviewers think of this movie.
Oh, well, Justin, I mean, as always, the attempts for rebellion and revolution are always to wake up a sleeping society, I think. And so, but sometimes you get worn out from that too. And then it ends up that somebody needs a nap.
So are you saying all these people that are writing these reviews are just tired revolutionaries?
Maybe that's it. We'll let the reviews determine. I've got quite a few here, but they're really short, most of them. So it's pretty good. Here's one pretty recent. It's from Pendragon, who said, V for fuck off. Half star. I like that one. Here's Twilight Girl 69.
Ew. Nice.
This is the dumbest movie I've ever seen, and it makes me want to go back in time and assassinate George Orwell for inspiring it. I don't know what's worse, Natalie Portman's British accent or the stupid Shakespeare references. Maybe the worst movie I've seen all year.
That's quite a statement coming from someone named Twilight Girl 69.
I had to include that just so you had context. Here's from Kai. She says, this is a terribly misguided, defamed, and liberal critique of the 2000s. Way to dilute the strong politics of Alan Moore's work. Also, it is intended to be aimless and shallow in its commentary because this film doesn't want to offer an alternative that doesn't conform to the liberal democratic status quo. I'm so sorry for the impressionable, poor, and petty bouge youth whose introduction to left politics starts and ends with this commodified dog shit. We need to do better political education. It's really funny watching this dubbed in a tag-along, though. I don't know what a tag-along is. Do you?
I mean, isn't that a cookie or something?
Sure. Siler Ellis says, atrocious adaptation of an incredibly powerful graphic novel. Why, yes, I am just saying this because V kisses the girl in this movie, which, one, misses the entire point of their friendship in the comic, and two, she's supposed to be a fucking minor. That's the point. What is wrong with you assholes?
Seems like a weird thing to get mad about, honestly.
Jack D says, this movie is incredibly dangerous to the rule of law and order. This and any fiction which promotes similar ideals should be removed from streaming sites and banned for the possibility of inciting violence.
Calm down, sir. Calm down.
Swindy says, thought this was a joke, couldn't take it seriously, was embarrassed throughout. Nothing but an incel's wet dream made real. I love that they're just coming from all over the place.
I know. They're from all different directions. That one was kind of funny on it. The incels wet dream part is pretty funny.
Lauren Hildebrand.
That's the only kind of dreams that incels have, honestly.
Flow Futuristic says, so first, I don't know the original work by Alan Moore. I was really disappointed and underwhelmed after watching it because everyone talks so much about this movie. The romance between V and Evie feels very forced, and not just because of the whole Stockholm Syndrome situation they got going on, which really made me mad, but also because it just doesn't seem very in character for V to fall in love. The politics in it seem very superficial. I get that the government is bad, but like, is that it? I guess it can make people think about things to a certain level, but honestly, that can lead anywhere. I think I would be fine with it if people didn't talk about it as if it's the deepest, most revolutionary thing in the world. Honestly, I was just kind of bored and annoyed. On the bright side, I'd never thought about making eggs on toast like that before.
That person's never heard of egg in a basket? Have you guys have heard of egg in a basket?
I had never heard.
Oh yeah.
I don't think anybody'd heard of it before this movie because, by God, I looked it up online, and every single recipe you find, like when you Google like egg in a basket or something, it says V for Vendetta's egg in a basket. And
well, it was around before. It may have had a different name, but it was around before this.
I got one more from Nate Kyman. One of the most ideologically unhinged and narratively overwrought films I've seen in quite some time. An absolute mess of post 9/11 paranoia, conspiracy theorist activism, and romanticized violence against women. The verbose script is an exhausting exercise in articulation for the purpose of making everyone unlucky enough to listen to it feel dumb. Though even more exhausting was attempting to prevent my eyes from rolling so entirely back into my skull at every alliterated introduction. A trend of the film, which within the opening few scenes has already dissolved into self-parody. V for Vendetta lunges toward thematic depth with the grace and consideration of a grand piano falling down a flight of stairs. Religious extremists, biological warfare, superhuman mutations, and necessary anarchy are but a few of the pieces of which the Wachowski brothers crafted narrative so tonally overburdened that V for Vendetta would better serve as satire for the sort of ideals it employs. Tack on a Stockholm romance and violence as salve for the world's sins, and you have a film which has already lost itself before most of its threads are introduced. Not even a trademark Wachowski slow motion fight scene could salvage V for Vendetta's meandering crawl toward an ideologically absurd conclusion. That being, of course, the only conclusion it can have, but somehow being even more ridiculous than anticipated once it's arrived. I'm scrambling to find some redeeming quality with which to end this rant, but most when V for Vendetta wasn't actively insulting my intelligence with its juvenile revolution, it was boring me with its hollow characters, horrendous pacing, and drab cinematography. Why I sat through it is a question that will likely keep me up for nights to come.
Wow.
And it's for that reason, it's keeping him up for nights to come, that Nate needs a nap.
He does need a nap. So you know who else needs a nap?
Who?
Alan Moore. Alan Moore was not a fan of this film. Alan Moore disassociated himself from the film at the time of its production and release due to his lack of involvement in the writing or direction of it. And he has, over the years, Moore has kind of become known as a cantankerous old fart, I would say, who will never be happy with any adaptation of his work. And that was the case before V for Vendetta. He was already, even at the time of this, I think League of Extraordinary Gentlemen had already come out prior to this, and he was very happy with
From
it.
Hell. So
From Hell, yep.
He's dealing with both of those, and by the time this rolled out, I mean, you're going into this, but he rejected all money and credit from Hollywood on any adaptations of his work.
Yeah, so his name's not on it. He turned down his fee, and
I will say he did give it to the artist, though. He did point it to the artist. So, that's at least a nicer thing to do, that if he wants nothing from it, that he gave it to the artist. David Lloyd, by the way, his only expectation of his adaptation was, I just want it to be good.
Yeah. And for this one, he got a copy of the Wachowski script beforehand. He called it rubbish. Said that it ran contrary to his original intent, which was to place two political extremes, fascism and anarchism, against one another, whereas the updated story was more explicitly about, as he said, quote, current American neoconservatism versus current American liberalism. So per his wishes, his name does not appear anywhere on the film at all, although David Lloyd's does, and David Lloyd did support the film and thought it was quite good. And he said that even Alan Moore, he's like, Alan Moore's never going to be happy with anything that's not a direct, exact adaptation of his comic. And Moore, as a result of this, there were some quotes from, I think, Joel Silver saying that Moore had endorsed it or something like that. And Warner Brothers refused to retract those quotes at Moore's request. And as a result, Moore cut ties with Warner, which means cutting ties with DC Comics completely. And I don't think that they've ever mended that relationship. I don't think he's ever done anything else for DC since the time of V for Vendetta's release, the movie's release.
Yeah, I was reading a lot about this, actually. I was just curious, like, what makes Alan Moore so cranky? I'm trying to be better about, like, seeing both sides of something, or like trying to understand why someone feels a way. And he criticized this. It's like, quote was like, it has more plot holes than you could have gotten away with on Whizzer and Chips in the 1960s. I don't even know what the fuck that means, but thanks, British people.
Some sort of obscure British television reference.
I think it's a sex move.
Yeah, so Joel Silver at a press conference said that Lana Wachowski had talked with Moore beforehand. And Moore was very excited. This is the quote. Moore was very excited about what Lana had to say. Moore disputed this. He said he told Wachowski, I didn't want anything to do with these films. I wasn't interested in Hollywood. And he demanded that DC Comics force Warner Brothers issue a public retraction, like you were talking about, and an apology for Joel Silver blatantly lying. Joel Silver tried to call Alan Moore directly to apologize, but they never did, like you said, issue a public retraction of that. He said, all that stuff you were just talking about, basically it's supposed to be about fascism versus anarchy, and those two words never occur anywhere in this film. It's been turned into a Bush era parable by people too timid to set a political satire in their own country, was the quote. The New York Times did an article in 2006, 5 days before it was released. And Joel Silver said in that article, he met with Alan Moore and David Gibbons when he required the rights for V for Vendetta and Watchmen. He said there, quote, Alan was odd, but he was enthusiastic and encouraging us to do this. I had foolishly thought that he wouldn't continue feeling that way today, not realizing, I was foolish thinking he would continue to feel that way today, not realizing that he wouldn't. Alan Moore did not. Go ahead.
2 decades. This is 2 decades later, because he acquired those rights in the late 80s. So we're talking 15 years later, probably. And Alan Moore's been, in his mind, burned by Hollywood because
that's a good point. Yeah,
the adaptations of Extraordinary Gentlemen and From Hell, which he was unhappy with. So he didn't.
Actually, now that you say that, yeah, he said Moore did not deny this meeting, nor Silver's characterization of himself. He never said that. He did say it's been 20 years. Anyway, in the same article, though, in the New York Times, one thing I did want to point out, David Lloyd said about Moore's reaction, quote, Mr. Lloyd, or this is a quote from the article, Mr. Lloyd, the illustrator for V Vendetta, also found it difficult to sympathize with Mr. Moore's protests. When he and Mr. Moore sold their film rights to the comic book, Mr. Lloyd said, quote, we didn't do it innocently. Neither myself nor Alan thought we were signing it over to a board of trustees who would look after it like the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so that's where they separate.
You're right. I think that it is kind of ironic that Moore's biggest complaint about the adaptation is that it's commenting on the then current events. It was a critique. The film, it does read as a critique of the regime of George W. Bush and the climate of a post 9/11 world, and specifically a post 9/11 America. And Moore, in his original story, was commenting on the then current events of the early to mid 80s. His story was a response to the government under the regime of Margaret Thatcher. So I think it's a little hypocritical of Moore to take issue with that the filmmakers were essentially doing the same thing that he had done, only with more recent politics. Now, they did, however, take more definitive sides than he had, whereas his original story was a little more ambiguous. But the film was still kind of a reaction to the times, kind of like what he had done.
I think the only reason it works probably is just because they did their own thing with it.
Right.
Like I think that Moore's work is too heady anyway. for it to have succeeded like V for Vendetta did. Not saying
As
they
a film.
couldn't have made a good movie, but it just he's like strictly dealing with, which is probably what attracted, to be honest, what attracted the Wachowskis to it, is because he is dealing with political philosophy and ideology and that sort of thing. He's not actually, it seems like in the graphic novel, even, I mean, he's obviously painting someone as the bad guy, but he's also trying to explain like how it gets there and like what happens.
Exactly. And also V is very much not painted as just like a hero.
It's very much this idea of like that physics or whatever. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So like as far as you go somewhere else, like something else is going to happen the other way. And it's going to always be that way.
V in the comics is portrayed as an insane person. Like clearly the experiments at Larkhill have driven him insane, in addition to other things, other abilities that they've given him. But he's an insane person. He's not necessarily like a superhero. And in the movie, he is definitely portrayed more explicitly as a good guy. But so in an interview earlier this year, because this year is the 15th anniversary of V for Vendetta, so there's been a lot of like articles out this year. But in an interview earlier this year that I read, James McTeigue said, quote, "What we were really doing with the film was saying that a lot of politics is cyclical. You always go through times when you have a tin-pot dictator for a totalitarian or reactionary government. We were holding a magnifying glass to that." And, you know, it's funny because we talk a lot about the prescience that certain filmmakers seem to have. Like this is something we talked about a lot on our Paul Verhoeven series. But is there anything that we've discussed so far in the show that seems as alarmingly relevant as this movie does in 2021?
I was just about to say, it had been a while. It had been a while for me, but I don't know that my wife had seen this since 2006. And she was like, this is very eerie. A lot of these things are hitting pretty close to home.
And a lot of those articles that I read that have came out for its anniversary this year, they couldn't help but point out the parallels. Like in this film's reality, a huge chunk of the population has been wiped out by a virus. The country is now being run by a neoconservative party that locks up gay citizens, and in the graphic novel, any non-white citizen that gets locked up or experimented on, or any other citizen who practices a religion outside of the state-sanctioned church. And there's a lot of support for state-run media, and we're not quite we have never reached quite as extreme a point as that. But, you know, last year, especially like 2020, you know, it sure felt like we were on a collision course with this kind of future. But I think that goes to McTeague's quote about the cyclical nature of politics. You know, like this movie will unfortunately probably always feel relevant at certain times in history.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. You know, the things that they were worried about back in Guy Fawkes's day, what goes around comes around. And we're seeing that as recently as last year, and stuff still continuing today.
Guys, I'm going to totally go out on a limb here and say, and I hate this because I feel like I'm going to get shit on again, but I think you can get all of that out of this because it's pretty generic. Like you could literally, anybody can watch. There's a political philosophy or like philosophy in general that says like people just like immediately tune out the parts they don't agree with, and they'll just accept the parts that they do. I think this is such a bland expression of like, I mean, the best I could pull out of it is that, violence is going to occur when people feel like their voices aren't heard. And that's what you could get out of it. And that's the generic principle that it's playing with. And other than that, it makes literally no statement whatsoever. Like what does V stand for? You don't have a statement that V stands for. He just wants to blow shit up. Like he's just doing it because freedom. And whoever can take that as liberals, conservatives, libertarians, like anybody.
And it has been that
it could be anybody could take that message and run with it for V.
And I think that's probably part of what Moore's issue with it is that he was a little more, for lack of a better term, revolutionary in his politics, more so than, I don't know if the Wachowskis just didn't have the nerve to do it, or if it's because they were working for a major studio, you know, and maybe they had to make something that was a little more palpable to the mainstream, or maybe it's because their last attempt at doing something that was a little more out there as far as audience expectation was the Matrix sequels, and those didn't go over particularly well with a lot of people. But this is also a response to, this is a time, this was made at a time in history where things, to a lot of people in politics, things were seemed a little more black and white. They weren't, but the perception of, because this was made in 2006, 5 years after 9/11. And one thing that it probably felt very revolutionary, or at least very radical of a move to make by having your main character in a movie 5 years after 9/11 be essentially a terrorist. I mean, V is a terrorist in this. Like Gary said, his ideals are not spelled out as well as they probably could be. But having a terrorist whose main source of, or his main weapon is blowing up big buildings, and he's supposed to be the hero of your movie, had you made him a little bit more morally ambiguous like he is in the comic books, I think it might have worked a little bit better. But I do like the movie still. I think it works well as a film, as a blockbuster film. I do think that the points that it makes about fascism and the creeping death of liberty, they're old points. They're not saying anything new, but they are points that they have a spotlight shown on them anytime that those in power are trying to undermine democracy, which is what was happening with the Patriot Act around the time that this came out. So there are times when this seems more relevant, even if its politics are a little, like Gary said, a little more vague, but there are times when they feel more relevant based on what's going on in the world around. Does that make sense?
Do you think that perhaps, in what we've discussed about the Wachowskis' filmography thus far, that the actual focus is the discovery of self?
I think you're fair there, because I don't think it's that the Wachowskis are idiots or anything like that. I'm not saying that. I'm not dissing the movie completely when I say what I'm saying. I'm saying, like, the movie is not attempting to get too deep into that. It's setting up a bunch of straw man arguments at points, and I'm sure that that's what Alan Moore's pissed off about. Or that it's not digging deeper into those thoughts. But if you take something like Justin pointed out, I mean, the big thing at this time, and especially what would have made it so impactful, is 9/11, the Patriot Act, all of that stuff. Like, people want to be able to control or hear like everything you see or do, and say, I mean, like, look at this setup and all the TVs that are all around everywhere. And it's about like, oh, you like sedate everybody with capitalism, I guess, is what they're trying to say, or what it seems like the movie's trying to say. But I guess, and I'm not trying to get too in the weeds on this either, but I'm just thinking, like, if I'm looking at this broadly, a lot of people could take that. Like, just for instance, and again, not trying to start a whole discussion down this rabbit hole, but if you were to say in 2021, watch this, and you were to say, oh, people are trying to silence art, trying to, like, you could immediately equate it to cancel culture is where I'm going to. Like, they would be like, oh, we're fighting against that because, like, they're telling us we can't listen to Dave Chappelle anymore, or they're whatever. Like, that's people will take whatever they want to out of it. The subject is too broad here. And maybe even for the Wachowskis, it's about that. It's about fighting yourself and fighting your own opinion and the freedom to discover who you are as an individual and that sort of thing.
Well, I think if anything, as far as its politics go, I think that you could watch it now in 2021, and it almost feels like it just doesn't go far enough with some of the stuff that it's trying to say. I found an article by a critic named Scott Meslow. He wrote, this is not a new article, it came out in 2018, so it's a few years old. But he wrote about the film. He says, it imagines a universe in which a single shooting death of an innocent girl could inspire an entire society to stand up against a militaristic police force. It imagines the resistance to an anti-democratic political movement rising up in part from powerful but principled members of that political movement. A modern adaptation might dismiss all those plot points as too optimistic. And I think he's kind of right. Like, because like there's a moment in this movie where it's about halfway through where we see a newspaper headline that reads 80,000 dead. And it's meant to be shocking to both the audience and the character who sees it. But now it's 2021, and we've in the last year and a half we've seen 3 million people died from the current pandemic. So the 80,000 dead doesn't have quite the shock that it did maybe in 2005. Yes. Okay. So we've touched a little bit on this, but and I do think all the Wachowskis films are political to a certain point, none more obviously probably than this one. But I think most importantly, this does continue the themes of identity and transformation that we see throughout their filmography. And I think that specifically, this is what Todd was I think hinting at. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Evie's story is a story of rebirth almost. It's a story about drawing strength from kind of becoming confident in her own identity. It's a major point in the story's narrative, even if from a personal standpoint, the way that V fuels her transformation is pretty cruel. But despite his methods, what V is doing is he's creating an environment that causes Evie to be liberated from her own fear, for being afraid to be who she is. The entire film, in fact, is about how fear either numbs us or turns us against each other. That's the entire method of suppression by the government in the film.
This is suppression of anything. You look at the beginning of this movie. Look at like the entire setup at the beginning is Evie, who, you know, through the movie you find out is like the daughter of revolutionaries, who, you know, has watched her parents die for their beliefs. And
right.
You can take that as far as you want to. Like they believed in something so much they died, and she's alone. She's trapped. She's like in her own little world, and she is at the beginning of the movie like making herself up in a mirror. And guess who else is? V is doing that. But no, it's a totally different scenario. Like they're creating like their alternate identity basically, right, from like who they are as a person. So it's clearly like that's a statement, like that's what they're going for. So I'm with that.
And I think that it's, despite the political stuff in the film, I think it's really Evie's transformation that's kind of the heart of the film. She even says there's that one point where she says that this is after she's had her head shaved and, you know, everything. And she says that she ran into like an old coworker and they looked each other in the eyes and the person didn't even recognize her. And I do think that tracks with a lot of the themes in the Wachowskis' other work. And I think the biggest theme in the end, and as cheesy as it sounds, I think one of the big themes in a lot of these movies is love conquers all, because that's really, it's Valerie's story that she reads when she's locked up. That story, you know, there's that moment where in Valerie's story that she's writing, where she says, she's talking about all this horrible stuff that's happened to her, but she's like, yeah, but for 3 years I had roses. And that's sort of the emotional crux of this entire story. And it's really what really fuels Evie to continue on and not give up and become who she's supposed to be. And you could say that about a lot of the Wachowskis movies, though, that like love, the love between the characters is sort of the crux of them moving on with their life. Like you could say it in Bound, you know, because Jennifer Tilly's character is pretending to be one thing that she's not until she falls in love with Gina Gershon. You could say it about Neo, and especially in the Matrix sequels, where it's his love for Trinity, because he's got a connection to the human world that causes him to move along his journey and face the machines at the end. It's really it's a theme that I didn't realize we were going to see recurring in these films when we started this series, but it's something that we've seen in every one of them so far.
I think, you know, along those same lines, I feel like it's kind of a little bit of a call to action of like, it's very easy to sit on the sidelines and just kind of, oh, well, it's going to work itself out. Right. And I think the idea of love, also what Justin was just saying, that idea of love and love conquers all, I think can also translate into care, you know, getting involved, whatever level. Yeah. And showing like, hey, yeah, the, you know, oppression comes in, you know, in many different forms, be it, you know, good for us, bad for us, be it the government or this terrorist, like they're both going about it the wrong way, but what are you going to do? And it's important that you care about this world because this is what you've got. And I think that kind of goes, so I see it as exactly what Justin said, but also sort of a call to action of like, hey, get off your ass, like go vote, pick up a book, you know, get involved, you know.
Yeah.
It's your world too.
Yeah, I mean, you could see it that way. And this is, again, though, like, because I feel like on the same token, another thing you could take from it is the fact that it's telling you, I do agree with the love sentiment, and I think it's about individuals and your individual identity, or like being able to be who you really are, and that sort of thing, which lines up with the Wachowskis, I feel like. But there's also the idea of, like, I don't know, I feel like if I looked hard enough, I could probably like tell you that it's also about not forcing it, like not that love is the way you inspire change, you don't force change. Like at first V kidnaps her and tries to make her see things his way, and it still doesn't work, because even when she's about to get fucking raped by that guy, the priest, she's still trying to turn V in because she's still afraid of V. He's still different and weird and like not, but it's not until like she starts getting out there and seeing the real world for what it is and seeing what's happening around her and reading that story that she starts to, she's inspired to accept who she is. It's not like you can't, it's not like a forcible thing. Like you can't, you know what I mean? So it's, I don't know. And maybe, and so that's why it's weird. Cause I like, it's broad enough that you can pull different, it's like the Bible. V for Vendetta is like the Bible.
as it's often said, yes, about V for Vendetta.
Oh, that's that old chestnut.
I guess that's where I'm going. So I didn't think I would say that line during this episode. But no, I just mean when you put some like broad, overarching philosophical stuff, you got to trust people to start pulling the stuff you hope they do out of it.
Yeah, which is why even the Guy Fawkes mask has become a symbol for so many differing political movements. Most famously, of course, Anonymous, and back in the early 2010s, I think it was, with Occupy Wall Street is when that really kind of took off. But that Guy Fawkes mask, just like the red pill, blue pill shit from the Matrix, is a symbol that's able to be used for either side. Multiple sides, it really can.
And V, like, I mean, if anything, one strict thing that V definitely says in the movie is that people shouldn't be afraid of their government. The government should be afraid of their people.
Yeah.
And that's always a thing. Like, I mean, and again, I guess either side could run with that. But the idea would be that, I go back to the thing about every action has an equal and opposite reaction, because like, whatever you allow your government to control, whatever you allow it to dictate for you, just keep in mind at some point that power could turn over to somebody else. Right. It could be the people you don't like. So you have to be careful about how much you rely on it and how much you rely on the people to make the right decisions.
Exactly.
To change.
So if you guys were going to do a V for Vendetta double feature, as we all, we always like to do this segment towards the end of the episode, what would you pair V for Vendetta with? There's a lot of options, but what would you guys pair V for Vendetta with as a double feature?
Well,
first of all, I'd pair it with anybody that doesn't say double feature.
I just keep saying it because I know how much you like it.
Well, I just finished talking about, that this is a call to action, the action being to care. And I would pair this with Equilibrium, where that is quite literally what they have problems doing. They have problems feeling, they have problems caring. And there's this totalitarian government that, is controlling quite literally the emotions of the people. And I think that would make thematically, I think that would make a good double feature there.
Yeah.
What about the Matrix? Have you guys thought about that?
That can work.
Just like you're waking up to the real world.
Let me write it down. What's it called again?
The Matrix.
The Matrix.
I'll even get weirder. How about the Watchmen?
Yeah, I mean, the Watchmen seems like an obvious one, but honestly, they would make a very good double feature. I happen to really like Zack Snyder's Watchmen. I know people are hit or miss on it, but I think the Watchmen would make a great double feature. If you're going to do a Alan Moore double feature, those are the two you want to do. I mean, I think From Hell's pretty good, but I would go Watchmen in this, because I like the way that they handle they handle, I feel like, a lot of the same themes.
Yeah, I was gonna say
Yeah.
roundabout. It's the same exact themes. Like just
Yeah.
even the Who Watches the Watchmen thing. Like is the
So Watchmen would be one of my choices, honestly. But if you do want to go another direction, I think would be fun. 1984, which came out in 1984, starring John Hurt. It's directed by Michael Radford. I mean, I think that would make a really good thematic double feature, and you get to see John Hurt in a very kind of opposite role. And it's a good movie. It's a great looking movie because it's Roger Deakins, the legendary Roger Deakins, did the cinematography in that film. But yeah, you should definitely check that one out if you haven't. I think that would work really well.
Nice.
So the Wachowskis, they would continue to work with James McTeigue after this film, although never to the same level of success, either critically or commercially. In 2007, McTeigue was brought in to do reshoots on a film called The Invasion, which was it was kind of an update of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, starring Nicole Kidman and Daniel Craig. I don't know if you guys remember this. It kind of came and went, but McTeigue only worked on the film for 17 days. He came in to fix stuff that the studio thought was an issue, working off of rewrites by the Wachowskis. This is all uncredited. None of their names are on the film. They kind of came in to try to fix it. Didn't work. The movie was still a bomb. But then in 2009, he returned to the director's chair for Ninja Assassin, which was produced by Joel Silver and the Wachowskis. Although this time the Wachowskis had no involvement in the script. They simply lent their names as producers. That film's script was actually written by Babylon 5 creator J. Michael Straczynski. Yeah. And I'm only mentioning that because it's a notable connection, because Straczynski years later would co-create the TV series Sense8 alongside the Wachowskis. And McTeigue actually directed a couple of episodes of that show as well.
Yeah. We've talked a lot about comics during this. If anybody is interested in some further reading, I may have mentioned it once or twice already, but J. Michael Straczynski turned in a great run of Amazing Spider-Man right after, leading up to and then post 9/11, the early 2000s. His run on The Amazing Spider-Man is really fantastic. It's really good.
Well, in between V for Vendetta and Ninja Assassin, McTeigue had one more film where he wasn't sitting in the director's chair, which is his last credit as an assistant director, and actually in this case a second unit director. In 2008, he did some second unit directing work on the film that would be the official follow-up to The Matrix for the Wachowskis. And that film was an adaptation of a Japanese cartoon from the 1960s, and it has split audiences and critics since its release in 2008.
And this show,
we're going to talk about it, and on this show in the past, and we're going to talk about it on our next episode. Next time, in 2 weeks, we're going to talk about Speed Racer.
Go Speed Racer, go!
And I'm excited about it because I happen to love it. I'm just going to put cards on the table. I love.
Well,
Speed
you can't
Racer.
go into it saying that, Justin. That's creates a bias.
Spoiler.
Well, I go into every movie hoping I'm going to love it. Here's the thing, so
yeah.
I'm just happy they actually get to work on some Japanese animation finally.
Yeah. So we'll check that out next week. It should be a fun discussion because the making of the movie is pretty wild. Its reception is wild. Its legacy is pretty fun. And I know that Gary in the past has not enjoyed it. So I'm hoping maybe he'll change his tune this time. It's happened before on the show.
It's happened
multiple times.
I'm going to go into it just like, okay, maybe I didn't understand it last time.
Yeah. So, and I don't know where Todd falls, so we'll find out next week. But yeah, it should be fun. Good time. So if you want to watch Speed Racer along with us, of course, it's probably pretty easy to find streaming. Head to cinemashock.net. We'll have links to everywhere that you can stream it currently. You can also find all of our episodes there on the website. You can find links to our social media. You can find links to our merchandise if you want to buy a Cinema Shock t-shirt or a Cinema Shock sticker or a Cinema Shock skateboard. You can get it's all out there. Wall clock. What do you want the logo on? We can figure it out. So well, guys, where can you be found on the internet for our listeners?
I'm at This Is Gary Horn on all the social medias. I have a wrestling podcast at TIPW Show. You should check it out.
Great pitch, Gary.
And I have a Star Trek podcast where we're covering the entire franchise in chronological order. It's called Computer Resume Podcast. And that can be found wherever you get your podcasts, and you can reach out to that show on the socials at Computer Resume. And I am at Mr. Todd Davis on all of the socials.
All right. And I'm at Justin_Bishop, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, where I've been logging my Halloween watch through, which I haven't watched a lot this year. I've been too busy and watching Wachowski movies and stuff. I haven't had a chance to watch as many horror movies as I'd like, but I have logged them there. Gary, I saw that your wife is very active on Letterboxd.
Hey, listen, I've been decently active. I
didn't even know she was using it. And I she commented on one of my reviews the other day. So I clicked on her profile, and like, she doesn't review things, but she logs like everything. It seems like.
She does. Yeah. She's how I'm remembering things I've watched. I'm trying to go back and complete my 2021. It's taken a while, but she's how I remember, because I don't know. We've got like a movie night with some friends on Wednesdays, and like I watch movies for this show, and
also just movies for fun.
And there's just the movies for fun, which all of Halloween is always horror movies. So I have to go back and like, gosh, shit, what did I watch? And anyway, I'm trying to be better about logging them relatively soon after I saw them, though, because it turns out no matter how hard I try, I will forget.
Yeah, I usually do it once the credits roll. Just log it, and then if I want to review it or star rate it later, I'll do that. But I'll at least log it so I remember that I watched it. Anyway, we're all on Letterboxd, I think. So you can also find Cinema Shock at cinema_shock on Twitter, Instagram. We're on Facebook. Go like us and go join our Facebook group on there. Go join our Discord. And until next week,
may the wings of liberty never lose a feather.
And be excellent to each other.
I want this podcast to realize that we stand on the edge of oblivion. I want every man, woman, and child to understand how close we are to chaos. I want everyone to remember Johnny has the key.